Lucky Boys Podcast.
North Koreans look at their leaders as a godlike entity. Is that true? Not just like the way we look at President Biden, right? We just go, okay, he's a human being,
right?
He's the president of the free world.
He's fallible,
right?
And we can say that, right?
Yes.
But again, we can say that, right? But in North Korea, in public, what I will say is that in public, they will say that, they will profess that, they will do all that. Now, deep down inside, do they really believe it? I'm not going to answer that with a positive or negative statement, right? But you're free in your thoughts there. But what you see outside doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. Now, they had to do that most likely because of survival, right? It is a totalitarian state. And, there's a lot more there. If you want to take a look at the development of Korea, even after the Korean War, after it had played out, and you had all these different factions, and even at the end, towards the end, where you had the first president of Korea, and there was a lot of corruption with his presidency and things like that, but he was really making a push for a united Korea, even towards the end, where he kind of did some unpopular things or things to kind of jeopardize that agreement, but he did it because he wanted a united Korea, right? But it was really, the U.S. they made this armistice. And so to this day, Korea is still technically at war. It was never a peace treaty. It didn't end. It's just a détente. So it's just kind of like the longest, Cold War or, that's been happening at that border. So anyways, going to your point, in the beginning, it seemed that, North Korea was actually doing better than South Korea economically. And what's funny is that
what era are we talking?
This was 1953, and then I think to the 1960s, even maybe even to the 70s, right? So they were actually better off then. In fact, they were developing faster than South Korea. So the whole country had kind of been torn by war.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So think of it like blank slate. Like everything's been decimated.
And
right?
then you had to redevelop everything and start over.
Right. So you not only had World War II, right, which there was probably a lot of stuff that happened there as well. Now you have the Korean War, which just completely raised the whole area. So now you're like, all right, so how are we going to do this, right? So you have Kim Il Sung, who came in, and he's the one who kind of led the development of North Korea. And according to what I know, and I have some resources, right, that will say that they were better off, and it's in the history books as well. They were better off initially. But later on, because you have an authoritarian regime where as they grab power, and what ended up happening, we say that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right.
And that's really what happened. There were instances where you began to see that there was this caste system. You can read about this. There was this caste system that was developed that was more grounded in your connections with people. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about your merit. It wasn't about anything. It was just, were you in the inner circles and things like that. And the closer that you were to leadership allowed you to be afforded certain privileges and things like that. Whereas the people who were outside of that, they're the ones that were sent out. But you have this wonderful ideology, right, that they were saying, the Marxist, Leninist ideologies, but...
Right, they started as Marxists.
Right. And, it may sound very good and things like that. And perhaps what I'm going to say is a bit, it may ruffle a few feathers, but in the end, there is leadership. There is the leadership that's to be had. And even amongst them, like, no matter what you have, if you have a leader that is looking after your people and says that they're looking after your people, then that's what they should be doing. But the people who were in power, because they got a taste of that power, they didn't want to let it go, right? And so if there was anything that disrupted it, or anyone that was seen as a threat, meaning that, they're getting more favor, things like that. There were a lot of things that happened in the background where there were a lot of disappearances, there were a lot of assassinations, there were a lot of, all that stuff behind.
Of political leaders?
Political leaders, military leaders, etc. Because again, it's all about power, right?
And these are these centers that
these
were...
aren't the centers. These were inside the leadership.
People.
Yeah. So there were people inside, right? And it became this chess game where people would have to kind of fight one another, and they would have to do it in other ways. So, when you start off, because you have that leadership, people who are there, they want to maintain that power. I mean, we see that in different ways everywhere. I mean, I don't think that's a communist thing. I think that's just human nature in certain ways, and it's an unfortunate aspect of human nature. but that's kind of what happened there. So initially it started off well, but then because of those influences, right, then we see things like, okay, Korea started going downhill, right? We saw, famines. We saw that people weren't getting...
North Korea,
yeah.
Right.
North Korea, we saw that there were famines. There was, people losing, seeing that, the people who were in leadership, they're like, wait, they're supposed to take care of us. They're not taking care of us, right? Everything belonged to the state, right? In the beginning, when they created this leadership, basically what they said was, we're going to take all the land. There's no property ownership. There's no private ownership of anything. Even the clothes on their back were owned by the state.
Was there a specific time period where that was a turning point where people started questioning what was happening?
I think that started probably in like the 70s and 80s, right? And because I forget off the top of my head what exactly happened there, but in the 70s and 80s, they started seeing the cracks in the leadership, started seeing that the leadership wasn't taking care of them because there were food problems, because people were hungry, right? Because they weren't getting the care that they needed, because, I'm pretty sure, when you have, once the power struggle started happening, hey, why did Mrs. Park's son die? Or why did Mr. Lee's kid? Why is it?
People are disappearing.
Things like that. Yeah. I mean, so it's only, you can only maintain that sort of anonymity or that sort of veil of how should I put it, utopian veil for so long before things start coming out, right?
before reality starts, looking very different from what you abstractly, I guess, were taught to believe.
Right.
North Korea has the 4th largest army. And is it true that that army is specifically designed to protect the government from its own people more than it is designed to protect from outside
influence.
forces?
That's like a yes and it's like a yes and a no, right? It's because it's everybody who is an able-bodied man is conscripted into the North Korean army. Okay.
South Korea is like that too,
Yeah,
right?
it's very common.
South Korea,
Because I know a lot of
for
people
time.
that told me that they had to
Singapore
go
is
back
similar.
to serve in the army when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but Korea, they decreased this, the longevity of it from like, what was it, 7 years to 5 years to now like 3 years or something like that. And
South Korea?
Yeah. And it's gotten shorter and shorter. But in North Korea, it's gotten longer. Like it can be like 5 years, 10 years, like even 20 years, So it's a longer time in North Korea where they have to stay in the military. But the reason that they stay in the military is also because they get fed.
Yeah, because that's one of the biggest issues there, is food scarcity.
Mm-hmm. And so during the famine, again, this is a first-hand account and stuff like that, but there are people there who are basically taking the grass from like even the parks and areas. They would take that and be eating that because there really wasn't anything. Rats and things like that were scarce, right? The famine
I
was
hear
so bad.
rats is a delicacy there.
I mean,
I mean, it's a
don't know.
delicacy
I
in
wouldn't-
certain parts of the world.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
that is true.
But I mean, when you're that hungry and when you're that starving, right?
Yeah.
Like you're taking the grass off the ground of somewhere and boiling that and then eating that, to survive.
Chopping down trees.
And this is not hyperbole. This is
That's
not anything like that. This is survival. And this was what I heard firsthand.
Yeah.
And so there were instances like this. You go there and you'll hear people will say like, "Oh, our city's the best. There's nothing wrong. Oh, everything's great." Da 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 da. And then like, "Oh, but we could use a little help," right? There's things like that, right? And it goes to show that even under a totalitarian, authoritarian regime, right, word gets out. There are sources of information, right? There are rumors, right? Well, how do those rumors start? How does gossip start? Well, it has to be something that initiates it.
Lucky Boys Podcast.